Genetic genealogy has become a powerful weapon in the hands of the authorities. Thanks to this new technology, hundreds of crimes that were unsolved for several years were solved in a short time. Tracking a criminal through his family tree sounds like something out of a movie, but it's real. In today's video, I'm going to talk about the Angie Dodge's case, a case that was only solved 23 years later thanks to the genetic genealogy and the persistence of a mother who never gave up trying to bring justice to her daughter. Angie Raye Dodge was born on December 21, 1977 in the city of Vancouver in the state of Washington in the United States. She was the youngest child and only child of Carol Dodge and Jack Dodge. In addition to her, the couple has 3 more children named Brent, Todd, and Roger. Angie had a good childhood. Her family is tight-knit and they used to do a lot of things together, such as camping and attending small events. The young woman loved to go camping with her family. She felt really free when she was in nature and didn't mind doing the other tasks, like setting up the tent, looking for the firewood, and cooking. For her, it was all a lot of fun. As her birthday was just 4 days before Christmas, the family decided that it would be better to combine the 2 special dates into one. Thus, Angie's birthday party was held at Christmas, along with the festivities that marked the birth of Christ the Savior. We can say that many children wouldn't like to have to share their birthday party with any other festivities. But Angie didn't mind. On the contrary, she liked to share her Christmas party. The family together, happy exchanging gifts. For her, that was priceless. In her childhood, Angie's family moved from Washington to the state of California, where Angie started preschool at a school in the city of San Diego. Later, the family moved from California to the state of Idaho, where they lived in the city of Idaho Falls, and it was there that Angie lived most of her life, completed elementary and high school. Angie was described as a cheerful, talented, and very enthusiastic person about life. It is said that she always liked to help, and while in high school, she used to teach English and math to children who were struggling in these subjects. Because she was very communicative, Angie made friends easily, and she also drew a lot of attention to herself wherever she went, as she was over 5 feet 10. In 1995, she graduated with honors from Idaho Falls High School and enrolled at Idaho State University in Aftermath. At that point in her life, Angie was very happy and full of plans for the future. Now a young woman, Angie always wanted to be independent, so she decided to rent an apartment on her own and moved in when she turned 18. She had been working in a beauty salon for some time, and with the income from this job, she was able to pay all of her bills and even bought a new car later on. It looked like everything was working out for Angie Dodge. Even though she had moved from her parents' house, she used to visit them often. On June 12, 1996, around 5:15 p.m., Angie made one very unique visit. She told her mother how happy she was living alone and being independent, and that despite the difficulties of adulthood, she was doing very well. In the middle of the conversation, Angie told her mother that she had done something stupid, but didn't want to go into details. Angie's mother didn't want to seem like she was interfering in her daughter's life, as she knew that she liked to be independent and liked to solve her problems by herself. So she decided not to pressure or ask too much. She just hugged Angie and said that she would always be her baby. The two continued talking for a while longer, until around 10:20 p.m. Angie said it was too late and she should go back to her apartment. Carol then gave her daughter a hug and said she loved her, after which they said goodbye and Angie left. This would be the last time Carol would see her daughter alive. The next day, June 13, 1996, Angie did not show up for her job at the beauty salon located in downtown Idaho Falls. Julia and Tony, 2 women who worked with her at the same salon, were surprised that she didn't show up. According to them, Angie had never done this before, and if she needed to miss work for some reason, at least she would have let them know. They've tried to contact Angie by calling her apartment numerous times, but to no avail. The 2 women then, very worried, decided to go to Angie's apartment to see if everything was okay. When they arrived at the scene, they knocked on the door and called Angie's name, but no one answered. They noticed that the door was unlocked, so they decided to enter the apartment. As they entered the living room, they noticed several plastic cups scattered around, used ashtrays and 2 full garbage bags that were close to the balcony, indicating that there had been a small get-together the day before. They went ahead in direction to Angie's room, which was at the back of the apartment. They were already having a bad feeling, and when they entered the room, they saw Angie lying on the floor with her head against the wall and bare naked. There was a lot of blood in the place, and right there, both of them could see that Angie was already lifeless. They called the police and they quickly arrived at the scene. According to detectives, There were no signs of break-in in the apartment, but there were signs of a fight. This could indicate that the victim knew the aggressor, but we must also take into account that many Americans didn't use to lock their doors in the 90s, which made life much easier for criminals. At the autopsy, it was revealed that Angie had 14 punctures in her body caused by a sharp object with a blade. Mayo fluid was also found in her private parts. The estimated time of the crime was between 1:45 and 4:45 in the morning. Her clothes and bedding were taken for tests and for DNA collection. Angie's relatives were devastated by the crime, especially Carol, who was very attached to her daughter. Angie's funeral was marked by a lot of commotion, and everyone wondered who could have done such a horrible thing to her. During the investigations, the detectives interrogated all the close people and those who had contact with Angie in the last few days. They discovered that Angie had been living in that apartment for less than a month, and that she only had one neighbor who lived downstairs, an elderly woman who told officers she hadn't heard anything unusual that night. Detectives also discovered that a few hours before the crime, Angie had received some people at her house, where they drank and talked for a while and then left. Neither these people nor neighbors around the site could help detectives, as they said they hadn't seen anything. The apartment where Angie lived and the crime took place was actually a large house that has been divided from the inside, creating a few individual apartments. Each apartment had its own garage and separated entrance, so someone could enter without having to run into other residents of the other apartments. As Angie had recently moved, she didn't have much furniture. In her bedroom there was only an air mattress, in the living room 2 small tables, and in the kitchen just enough to prepare a meal. Detectives believe that if Angie didn't know her attacker and didn't leave the door to her apartment unlocked, the criminal may have simply climbed the premises and entered through an open window. The murder weapon, which was a knife, wasn't found, and it seems that the criminal brought it with him from his home, as no knife was missing from Angie's apartment. Since no one around Angie's apartment, and not even her downstairs neighbor, heard anything, it was likely that the criminal took her by surprise and quickly silenced her. There were signs of a struggle, as I have already mentioned, and we must remember that Angie was over 6 feet tall and did not make it easy for her attacker, fighting him to the end. Detectives believed that whoever was responsible for the crime knew the victim's routine or was even a person close to her. This person certainly knew that Angie lived alone, and on the day of the crime, she had received some people in her apartment hours before she was attacked, indicating that the criminal might have been lurking, just waiting for the right moment to act. Detectives also had a theory that there could be more than one criminal responsible for the crime. The best evidence the authorities had was the male DNA found on Angie's body. However, at the time, they were not used to a crime of this nature. Something like this was not common there, and they felt a little overwhelmed, even more by the constant pressure from the population and the media. 6 months had passed, and the detectives had not been able to obtain substantial evidence that could lead them to the person responsible for the crime. With this, the community's frustration was increasing. Carol Dodge, Angie's mother, even said at the time that she knew the city's police officers weren't qualified for that kind of investigation. She also said that she swore on her own life that she would go to the end to seek justice for her daughter. Carol then went on to hand out flyers offering a $5,000 reward for any information that would help catch the person responsible. Although $5,000 is a relevant amount, even more for the 90s, unfortunately, it didn't bring much result and Carol didn't get any relevant information. The woman then proceeded to patrol the streets late into the night, asking everyone she met if they had any information about the crime. In addition, she was constantly going to the city police station to find out what the department was doing to track down the person responsible for her daughter's murder. According to her, she wasn't always welcome. She used to enter the station through the back door with the intention of catching them by surprise to see if they were really working. The police even nicknamed this door Carol's door due to the frequency with which she appeared there by surprise. Also, according to Carol, due to her constant demands on the police and her persistence in wanting to solve the case, some police officers started laughing at her, calling her the crazy grieving mother. Not only Carol, but Angie's entire family was frustrated and wanted answers. The headlines were also critical of the police department. In January 1997, 7 months after the crime, police in the state of Nevada, a neighboring state to Idaho, arrested a man named Benjamin Hobbs for a crime very similar to the one that killed Angie Dodge. Benjamin was accused of having attacked and threatened a woman with a knife, forcing her to have sex with him. But unlike Angie, this victim was left alive and able to testify against her attacker. When Idaho Falls detectives learned of this crime in the neighboring state, they turned their full attention to Benjamin Hobbs, and not for nothing. Benjamin was from Idaho Falls, and many in town knew him, and that he knew Angie Dodge. To the detectives, there was a good chance he was responsible for the crime against Angie, as Benjamin was already arrested in Nevada and in police custody there. The Idaho Falls detectives decided to focus their investigations on a young man named Christopher Tapp, as he was Benjamin's best friend, and the detectives had the theory that more of a person had participated in the crime against Angie. Christopher, better known as Chris, was 19 years old and unemployed at the time. He had dropped out of school and spent most of his time with a group of teenagers known as the River Rats. This group was well known in Idaho Falls. They spent entire summers playing and drinking on the bank of the river that cuts through the city. Christopher and Angie knew each other. They weren't close friends, but they did talk to each other on a few occasions. Angie also knew several of the kids who were part of the River Rats, which was common in Idaho Falls as the town was small and pretty much everyone knew each other. Over the course of 3 weeks, Christopher was interrogated 9 times and subjected to 7 lie detection tests. In that same period, detectives collected his DNA and that of several other men linked to him and Benjamin. Detectives also asked Nevada police to send a sample of Benjamin's DNA so they could match it to the male DNA found on Angie's body. At first, during Christopher's interrogation, the detectives only asked him about Benjamin. They wanted to know if he had any information that could link Benjamin to the crime. The boy cooperated with the police all along, but told them that he didn't know anything about Benjamin that would help them solve the case. With that, the detectives who already suspected his participation in the crime began to think that he knew something but was trying to hide it because he was probably involved. The interrogations became more intense and exhausting, and Christopher continued to deny that he knew anything. The detectives, desperate to close the case soon, even offered the boy full immunity if he had told anything that linked Benjamin to the crime. Christopher once again said he couldn't help them as he didn't know anything. The detectives then decided to appeal. They put the boy through the lie detector again, and this time, a polygraphy specialist said he was lying. Christopher was desperate, but understood that it would never end if he didn't give the detectives what they wanted. It was then that he decided to confess, thinking it would get him out of the situation, and the detectives would leave him alone. Christopher told detectives that Benjamin was responsible for the crime and that he was with him in Angie's apartment when she was attacked. Afraid and desperate, the boy came to give 6 different versions of the crime. The detectives finally got what they wanted, a confession from someone with a connection to the victim so the case could be closed. But there was a problem. The DNA of Christopher, Benjamin, and all of the other men the detectives had collected came back negative from the male DNA found at the crime scene. The detectives now had to be quick and think of some strategy not to let the opportunity to close the case slip away, and they were. The detectives began pressuring Christopher once more, saying that he knew there was a third person who participated in the crime. Under pressure, the boy named Jeremy Sarger, a mutual friend of his and Benjamin, but Jeremy's DNA also came negative. The detectives then argued that Christopher lied to them and that this completely nullified his offer of immunity. Now the boy would go to prison and face capital punishment. Christopher became even more desperate. The detectives realized this and took advantage of the situation. They told the boy that he would probably get capital punishment for the violence of the crime, but that if he confessed that he was responsible for taking Angie's life, they could get him a good deal with the prosecution and he would only face life in prison. They also said that if he wanted to save his life, he would have to admit the crime. Christopher, cornered and very afraid, ended up confessing that he was the author of the crime. With that, Benjamin Hobbs and Jeremy Sarger were released from the crime, but Benjamin remained in prison for the crime he committed in Nevada. Christopher did everything he could to try to save himself, but the truth is that he only managed to get even more complicated. His trial began in May 1998. Many who followed the case turned their attention to his trial. In court, Christopher's mother followed everything desolate. She cried while the other people present looked at her son with contempt. Christopher himself was looking downcast. Just over a year ago, he was a free and innocent young man who was just trying to find his place in the world, but now he was stuck, sitting in the dock accused of a terrible crime, and everyone looked at him as if he were a monster. Christopher knew that his fate would be decided there, a fate that was far from good. During his trial, the boy said that his confession was forced and that he was innocent, but just by looking around you could tell that no one believed him. After all, it was the word of an idle young man who had dropped out of school against the detective's word. And to further complicate matters for Christopher, the police brought forward a witness for the prosecution, a young woman named Destiny Osborne, who claimed to have overheard Christopher at a party talking about committing a crime. Years later, Destiny recanted and said she was coerced by the police into giving this false testimony. After a little over 13 hours, the jury found Christopher Tapp guilty of the crime against Angie Dodge and sentenced him to life in prison. When the unanimous verdict was read, the young man slumped in his chair and began to cry. Carol Dodge, Angie's mother, watched the trial from start to finish, all the while looking at Christopher. She said she was frustrated that the boy did not give it to another person who had allegedly participated in the crime and left his DNA on her daughter's body. She also said that she even wrote a letter to Christopher before the trial, asking him to talk about who that person was during the trial, and when he didn't, she was furious with him. In Carol's mind, she didn't understand why the boy was protecting this person so much to the point of taking all the blame himself. After the trial, everyone seemed satisfied with the outcome. Finally, the person responsible for a terrible crime that shook the city would spend the rest of his life behind bars in a maximum security prison. But Carol Dodge was still not satisfied. After all, the DNA found in her daughter's body was not that of Christopher Tapp, which meant that there was still a person responsible for the crime on the loose. Carol told herself she wouldn't rest until she found out who had left the DNA at the crime scene. The detectives even told her they would keep looking for this person, but Carol felt they wouldn't and decided on her own to seek justice for her daughter. In the following years, Carol alone tried to find clues that would lead her to the whereabouts of the person responsible for the crime, but at first, nothing came of it. Meanwhile, Christopher Tapp remained incarcerated in a maximum security prison in Idaho and was later sent to another maximum security prison in Texas. In 2001, Christopher officially withdrew from his confession. His lawyers came to file several appeals for the case to be reviewed, but they were not successful and he remained in prison. A few years later, Carol received a call from an inmate who was in the same prison as Christopher. This inmate asked her what she wanted to happen to Christopher, that he would fix the boy for her if she wanted to. Carol said she didn't want anything to happen to the boy. She just wanted him to come to the other person who participated in the crime, the person whose DNA was found at the crime scene. Sometime later, Carol received a letter at her home. This letter had been written by Christopher, where he said he was innocent and that he had been forced to confess to a crime he had not committed. Carol thought he was lying and that he again wanted to protect the other criminal. For her, Christopher either liked this person too much or he was too afraid. In 2008, more than 10 years after the crime, Carol continued to investigate the case on her own. In the hands of the police, the case had stalled, no new leads had been found, and locating the owner of the DNA at the crime scene seemed increasingly unlikely. Carol had reviewed numerous documents and police reports regarding the case in hopes of finding something the detectives might have missed, but so far, she hadn't. She then decided to ask for access to Christopher Tapp's interrogation tapes. She hoped to understand why he didn't name the other criminal, and she did. Carol watched the more than 60 hours of video of the boy's interrogation and came to the conclusion that she had never considered. Christopher was innocent. Upon viewing the videos, Carol realized that Christopher was very scared, and the detectives took advantage of this by forcing him to confess. She also noticed that Christopher was never in his daughter's apartment, because when he confessed giving 6 different versions, he didn't even know what the place was like inside. The apartment was small, and if he even had been there, he would have known exactly where each room was. At the time, Carol was observing this twist. Christopher Tapp, who had already been in prison for more than a decade for a crime he didn't commit, sent a letter to a group called the Idaho Innocence Project, begging them to heed his case. This group is a non-profit organization that aims to correct and prevent wrongful convictions. They review the case completely, and if they find inconsistencies that led the authorities to arrest someone innocent, they proceed to investigate and assemble a report with a legal basis to be taken to the judge and finally free the person who didn't deserve to be imprisoned. Christopher's letter reached this group. However, they were already reviewing other cases and the boy had to wait. Carol, now knowing that Christopher was indeed innocent, contacted his lawyer and told him about believing the boy was innocent. The two teamed up so the case could be reviewed, but again, it was in vain. In 2009, DNA found at the crime scene was placed in the United States criminal database, known as CODIS, but no other DNA was found to match. A few years later, Carol received a computer as a Christmas present. When connecting to the internet, she began to research ways that could help her in her private investigation. It was then that she discovered a company located in the state of Florida that could identify a person's race through DNA. Carol contacted the police, who agreed to do this test. Using DNA found at the crime scene, the result confirmed that the unknown was 85% white, which helped rule out several possible suspects. However, this was still not enough, and the case was still far from being solved. Carol continued with her private investigation in later years, but realized that she would need the help of experts to achieve her goal. In 2013, Carol, along with Christopher Tapp's attorney and the group from the Idaho Innocence Project who are now working on the case, came into contact with a man named Stephen Drizzen. Stephen is one of America's leading experts on false confessions, and he was given the task of analyzing Christopher's confession through more than 60 hours of interrogation recording. By this time, Carol and Christopher had already developed a certain friendship. They communicated regularly, and we can say that the two joined forces towards the same goal, which was to find the real responsible for the crime. After reviewing the interrogation recordings, Stephen came to the conclusion that everyone expected. Christopher was innocent and had been coerced by detectives into confessing to a crime he didn't commit. In 2014, Stephen completed the report and sent it to the Idaho Court of Appeals, which would review the case. The following year, 2015, the prosecution hired an independent investigator to review Christopher Tapp's conviction. In his report, the investigator determined that much of the information the boy stated during his interrogation was forced by detectives. However, the investigator concluded that Christopher was at Angie's apartment when she was attacked, but had no direct involvement in the crime. With that, in the year 2016, Christopher's attorney filed a motion for relief after conviction. But before that motion could be heard, the attorney managed to strike a deal with the prosecution to reduce Christopher's sentence to time already fulfilled. The heavier charges were dropped, as there was no physical evidence that he was actually involved in the crime, but an accomplice charge remained. In 2017, after spending more than 20 years in prison, Christopher Tapp was finally released from prison. Carol Dodge, Angie's mother, personally came to the prison to welcome him and welcome him to freedom. Christopher even said that if it weren't for her, he would still be stuck, and that he was so grateful that she had no idea. Even though he was free, Christopher was still seen as a criminal by the community, and he knew that to change that, the real perpetrator of the crime would have to be caught. Having spent more than 20 years in prison, Christopher found almost everything out of prison strange, especially the technology that has evolved a lot in the recent years. For him, it was like having traveled to the future. Also, all of his old friends were now married, with kids, jobs, and bills, something that was deprived of him. Now out of prison, he could personally assist Carol in her private investigation towards the same goal. In 2017, a new chief of police and new captain took over the Idaho Falls Department, they being Bryce Johnson and Bill Squires. Both met with Carol Dodge and said they would do their best to catch the criminal who took her daughter's life in 1996. Well, before we continue, we need to go back a little bit in time. More precisely in December 2014, when Idaho Falls police found a potential suspect. His name was Michael Ursi Jr., a filmmaker who lives in New Orleans, Louisiana, more than 3,000 kilometers from Idaho Falls. The police go to him after they used the DNA found at the crime scene and compared it with all the DNA that was in public database at a company called Ancestry. This is one of those companies where you send your DNA and they'll tell you exactly what region of the planet your ancestors came from. In addition, they managed to assemble your family tree through public records that were entered by other company customers. And it is very common for people to find distant relatives after they have inserted their DNA into Ancestry. Years earlier, Michael Ursi Jr.'s father had inserted his DNA into another genealogy company that was later purchased by Ancestry. When detectives used the criminal's DNA in that company's database, they found the DNA of Michael's father that matched 34 or 35 alleles verified. This meant that the criminal was a close relative of his, probably between 3 or 4 generations in the same family. The cops then focused on his son, Michael Ursi Jr., but not just because of the DNA, but because the detectives also discovered that he was in Idaho Falls at the same time as the crime, and for them, it didn't seem to be just a coincidence. According to Michael, the Idaho officers went to his house with a Louisiana officer and took him to a room in the state police office where he was questioned. Detectives started asking if he had ever been to Idaho, and Michael replied that he had, and that he had been through the state with friends many years ago when he was 19, and that they stayed for one night in the town of Rexburg, which is about 45 miles from Idaho Falls. For the detectives, there was a good chance that Michael was the man they were looking for, and the coincidence didn't stop with this passage through Idaho. Michael produced a short film years before, whose story is based on a girl who had an almost identical fate to Angie Dodge. In addition, during the interrogation of Christopher Tapp in '97, the name of an alleged accomplice, Mike, was mentioned, in a common nickname for someone who calls himself Michael. In interrogation of Michael Ursi Jr., the detectives did not give him details of why he was being interrogated. They just asked a few questions and then collected his DNA. Michael was very scared and asked what was going on and if he needed to call a lawyer. Detectives said it was necessary, that they already had what they wanted, and that they would take him back to the house. After being dropped off at his front door by detectives, Michael said he stood on the sidewalk for a while trying to understand what was going on. He said he went into his house and started searching the internet for something that happened in Idaho Falls around the time he traveled to the area. It was then that he came across the case of Angie Dodge that had happened unsolved for several years. Michael further said that he couldn't sleep for the next few days until on January 13, 2015, he received an email from the Idaho Falls police saying he wanted him to know that his DNA did not match the DNA found at the crime scene. Although the criminal's DNA did not match Michael's, they had many similarities, which meant that Michael and the person responsible for the crime were related. Carol Dodge knew this, so she went to Michael, gave him a paper, and asked him to make a list of all his ancestors and relatives that he knew of. Carol was still determined to find the man who took her daughter's life, and as Michael was related to that man, she was hopeful that this list would help her solve the case. Michael was impressed by Carol's strength and determination and decided to help her on her quest. However, the list made by him did not help much in the investigations, and again the case was stopped. Now let's fast forward a little in time, more precisely to the end of the year 2018, when Carol, along with the Idaho Falls Police Department, contacted C.C. Moore. C.C. Moore is an expert in genetic genealogy. She is famous for helping the U.S. authorities solve over 70 cold cases in the last 4 years. Carol and the Idaho Falls Police contacted C.C. Moore to have her help them on the case by tracking the criminal through genetic genealogy. At first, C.C. Moore refused, saying that by the time the DNA sample had been collected, it could be very degraded, and because of that, it would not be possible to reach the criminal. But Carol didn't take no for an answer. She had been in this fight for over 20 years, and it wouldn't be now that she would stop. Carol contacted C.C. Moore and recounted her entire journey in seeking justice for her daughter, and begged the woman to help her. C.C., admired by Carol's persistence, agreed to help her in the case. Also in 2018, C.C. Moore entered the criminal's DNA into GEDmatch. GEDmatch is a free website where people can create their profile by entering their DNA in search of relatives. It's like a social network where you can find people who have some genetic link with you, that is, a distant relative from another branch of your family tree. Currently, GEDmatch has millions of profiles registered on this website. And when registering, you have the option to keep your profile public where other people can find you, and your DNA can also be used by the authorities in some investigation, or you can keep your private profile. This, according to GEDmatch itself, is to maintain the privacy of its users. After entering the criminal's DNA into GEDmatch, C.C. Moore found that the criminal was indeed a relative of Michael Ursi Jr., but a distant relative of another lineage that even Michael himself was not aware of. C.C. then tracked down people who belonged to the same bloodline as the criminal, and through public records such as birth certificates and obituaries, she was able to put together a family tree that led her to Clarence Ursi and Cleo Landrum, the couple that gave rise to that lineage. C.C. believed that the criminal could be this couple's grandson or great-grandson, so she made a list of all the males in Clarence's lineage and discarded those who were children and those who had already died at the time of the crime. That left only the name of 6 men on the list, and C.C. Moore believed the criminal was likely one of them. She passed everything she found out to Carol and the Idaho Falls Police. Detectives then began to gather information about these men, and one of them lived in the state of Idaho. Now, they needed their DNA to know who was responsible for the crime that took place in 1996. Detectives followed these 6 men for days in order to obtain a DNA sample. It could be a soda can, a straw, a butt cigarette, anyway, anything they discarded with their DNA. After getting everyone's DNA, the detectives sent the samples for analysis, and that's when the unpleasant surprise came. None of the 6 DNAs collected from the suspects matched the criminal's DNA, which means that no one of those 6 men were responsible for the crime that the authorities were looking for over 20 years. Carol was very frustrated, and C.C. Moore even more. The genealogist began to think about what could have gone wrong. What had she missed? Had she made a mistake? She went back through the family tree she just put together and all of the records she'd used during the research. It was then that she found something she had missed. one of the men of Clarence Urser's lineage, married very young. His marriage was short-lived and he had no children from that marriage. Well, that's according to the records, but in fact, when this man separated from his wife, she was pregnant with a boy. It is not known whether this man was aware of this or not, but what is known is that as soon as the couple divorced, the woman started a relationship with another man. So when this child was born, it was registered under the surname of her stepfather, which is Drips. The boy was named Brian Lee Drips. He was 31 years old in 1996, the year the time took place. C.C. Moore passed this new information on to the detectives, who quickly began investigating this man. They discovered that at the time of the crime, Brian lived in Idaho Falls, and not only that, his house was across the street from Angie Dodge's apartment. The detectives also discovered that Brian was one of the first men to be questioned by the police, as he was the victim's neighbor, but for some reason they didn't collect his DNA at the time, and a few months later he moved out of town. Brian was now living in Caldwell, an Idaho town about 500 kilometers from Idaho Falls. In the year 2019, detectives started following Brian in order to obtain a DNA sample. It is said that in the first few hours after Brian, he threw a cigarette butt out of the car window. One of the detectives then ran to get this butt, but there was a traffic and one of the cars ran over the butt, leaving the sample unusable. Because of this, the detectives had to keep an eye on Brian for a while longer, until on Monday 10, 2019, he threw another cigarette butt out of the car window, and this time, more than one detective acted, while one stopped the car and the other collected the sample intact. Detectives quickly took the sample to the Idaho State Laboratory and asked for priority analysis. The employees of this laboratory were already familiar with the case. They already knew Carol, mother of the victim, and all of the others involved who were working to solve it. They knew the importance of this result. The lab remained open into the night, and the team worked over the weekend to extract the DNA and match it to the DNA left in the crime scene. And after more than 2 decades and more than 100 DNA samples analyzed, the result was positive. Brian Lee Drips was responsible for the crime that killed Angie Dodge in 1996. Upon receiving the news, Carol and everyone else involved in the investigation celebrated like never before. All of the struggle, the persistence, years of research, and everything else finally brought a result. Now the detectives had to arrest Brian and bring him to justice. The Idaho Falls Police Department coordinated an operation to arrest the man. They knew he went to the grocery store around noon every day, so the plan was to arrest him outside his home. But as the detective followed, Brian turned right instead of left, which was the way to the supermarket. After that, he drove for a long time with the car, as if he realized he was being followed. At one point he stopped at a dead-end street and entered a bank. Detectives were waiting for him outside and approached him as soon as he left the place. Brian couldn't resist arrest and agreed to go to the police department. During his interrogation, he initially denied that he had committed the crime, but after 5 hours with detectives showing all the evidence, he asked for a cigarette, and while smoking he said, "Yeah, looks like you guys got me." Brian was charged with the crime that same night. The next morning, the Idaho Falls Police Department held a press conference attended by Carol Dodge, family members, C.C. Moore, and Christopher Tapp, the man wrongfully arrested for the crime. In this nearly 2-hour briefing, Idaho Falls Police chiefs revealed the identity of the man who had committed the crime in 1996 and answered questions from journalists covering the case. Carol Dodge also spoke at the press conference. Clearly emotional, the woman said that a year before, she thought about giving up the case. She was tired and crying, asked for her daughter's forgiveness, saying that she had gone as far as she could. It was then she felt her daughter saying, "You're almost there, Mom." The news of the arrest of the person responsible for the crime that killed Angie Dodge in 1996 reverberated throughout the country. This was another case that after many years, thanks to technology of genetic genealogy, was solved. Well, before we continue, I'm going to talk a little about Brian Lee Drips. What did the police find out about him and what was his motivation for committing the crime? According to the police, Brian had no criminal history that could link him to the crime. In 1989, he was convicted of drunk driving. 2 years later, in 1991, he was convicted again for the same crime. In 1996, the same year he committed the crime, his wife, who was pregnant with the couple's first child, filed for divorce, but they did not separate and remained together until 1999 and had 2 more children in the meantime. According to this woman, Brian was a user and extremely violent. She had tried to leave him, but as soon as the first child was born, they stayed together. moved to the state of California, where they had 2 more children, and they returned to Idaho to live in the city of Caldwell, which was where Brian's mother lived. The woman also said that she was a former user and that because of that, when she and Brian divorced, she lost custody of the children, who stayed with their grandparents, so she moved to the state of Nevada, where she currently lives with her new husband. According to the police, Brian watched the victim that night and waited for the right moment to strike. This was easy for him, as he was the neighbor and he had a good view of the young woman's apartment, and as soon as her friends left, he went to the place and committed the crime. Asked about the motive, Brian said he didn't have one and that he didn't know the victim personally. He also said that he was under the influence of alcohol and narcotics and that he acted alone. The detectives suspected Brian may be responsible for more crimes, but so far have been unable to link him to any other cases. Due to the substance of the crime he committed in 1996, he could face capital punishment. But before his trial date, he struck a deal with the prosecution where he pleaded guilty to the crime. That way, he wouldn't be taken to jury and get a lighter sentence. In June 2001, Brian Lee Drapes was sentenced to life in prison for the crime that killed Angie Dodge in 1996. Kara Dodge followed everything closely, and when the sentence was handed down, she made a face of relief and look of accomplishment. After Brian's convictions, Christopher Tapp, who spent 20 years in prison for the crime he didn't commit, had all charges against him dropped. Today he's rebuilding his life, has a good job, is married, and is suing the Idaho Falls Police Department for what they did to him. Christopher even went so far as to say that when he found out that Brian was responsible for the crime, he got a fright because he knew him by sight and told the police to collect his DNA back then, but the police told him to keep quiet and let them work because they knew what they were doing. Carol Dodge and her family, despite the pain that has not gone away, felt that justice has been done. Together they started a fundraising project called Five for Hope, which aims to raise funds to be used in solving unsolved cases across the country. These donations can be made at angiedodge.com. There are currently over 200,000 unsolved crimes in the United States, and Angie's family believes that with this initiative, they can help solve some cases and bring justice to some families. Well folks, that was the case today. Thank you so much for watching me to the end, and I'll see you next time.